Why is Outer Dark by Cormac McCarthy his most taboo novel? Where does all this incestuousness and the Southern Deliverance character archetypes come from? Welcome to episode number 2 of exploring Cormac McCarthy's literary influences. And today we are going to be talking about the two major influences of Outer Dark. Number 1 being existentialism, and number 2, his divorce from his wife, Lee McCarthy. So this is just one of many series and many videos on Cormac McCarthy that are being dropped on this channel daily. If you want to be a part of a Cormac McCarthy community, you have come to the right place. And if you would like to go deeper with McCarthy's works, then sign up for my newsletter. The link is down below. There are a ton of great things I am sending out to the newsletter in the coming weeks, a couple ebooks, exclusive videos, and an exclusive interview. So sign up so that you guys don't miss out on those. So let us talk about the major influence of Cormac McCarthy's second novel, Outer Dark, and that is his divorce from his wife, Lee McCarthy. And McCarthy starts to bring in some David Lynch Eraserhead type energy with all this. And I absolutely love this connection because if you guys know David Lynch, his first movie, Eraserhead, was about this, guy who has this baby with his wife he doesn't really like, and the baby's this deformed thing, and he eventually, I think, kills it. And McCarthy, at the time of starting Outer Dark, was in a very similar position. He had married Lee McCarthy, and they had a son, Cullen, together. But she wanted him to get a job. They were living in poverty. They were having a very hard time. And she was also a writer, and she wanted him to work. And he said, no, you need to go work so I can write. I have this deal with Random House for The Orchard Keeper, which still hadn't come out yet. And he's like, I can make this happen. She didn't like that, and she didn't like that mindset. So she left with his son, and McCarthy never really connected with his son. But you would have to think that maybe at some level, because we have this baby, we have Kola and Rinthi sisters. And if we look at the main plot of the novel, it's not about the baby, right? It's about two people who are in a cabin in Appalachia who start going their separate ways. They, go on their own separate journeys. And that's what happened with McCarthy and his wife, Lee. That's what divorce is. You're going your separate ways, but there is this baby. And what are we going to do with this baby? Well, McCarthy, this baby is now killed. He leaves it out in the woods. And maybe that is some, weird projection in his mind of what he wanted to do, because he had these dreams that he realized of being this great writer. I'm sure he knew he had the talent to do it. And having a kid and having a wife and nagging you to get a job might be hard, and you might start to fixate on some of these ideas. I'm not saying that he did, but once again, it is a common theme at the time because Eraserhead came out about 9 years later. And McCarthy was going through a very hard time in his life when he was starting to write Outer Dark, divorce, wife and son leave. And it's the only time that he was actually keeping a schedule because, as he said on Oprah, that he doesn't plot out novels. Well, with the Outer Dark, he was actually doing some of the productivity hacks that writers are supposed to do. He was recording how many words he was writing, the time he spent writing, keeping a schedule. And he had also written an exploratory first draft that was really just a way to get out some plot points so that then he could build the plot and themes. And as we're about to talk about in a couple minutes, he was deliberately, creating characters and themes and plot ideas way before he actually solidified a lot of the work that we saw in Outer Dark. A lot of the very early stuff was very different, and he was figuring it out and plotting it out. Probably because the amount of stress, you have all this stress and some of that creative energy isn't there. So what can we do? We can plot a lot of this out. We can create kind of these biblical archetypes and we can follow them and, use more of the logical mind rather than the unconscious, the Kool-Aid problem. And Diane C. Lucy, basically the authority on McCarthy's time in the South in writing Southern novels, said that he was struggling a lot, that in a lot of the early drafts of the Outer Dark, McCarthy was writing about, Kola and Rinthi having these hard times at Thanksgiving and at Christmas, stuff that we never see. And McCarthy spent those holidays alone during those times, during, those couple years of writing Outer Dark. And as you know, it's the holiday season right now, and I don't give a fuck about the holidays, but for people that do, it is sad to be alone, and everyone else is celebrating and you are alone. My first holiday I got to spend alone from my family, that Thanksgiving and Christmas, me and my roommate just did a bunch of psychedelics and went skiing. It was great. I was like, oh my God, holidays suck. And McCarthy also wrote, after a couple months of taking time off from Outer Dark, that prospects are dim, writing equals happy. And another interesting note is that when you look at the Orchard Keeper can be confusing, right? It's almost very similar to Outer Dark, that we have these characters and they're all kind of moving on multiple timelines. And even though they are connecting, they don't know, the knowledge of their connections, And in Outer Dark, it's much more clean, right? We have these characters and chapter separation. And that was actually a main critique and something that McCarthy had to fix, that his editor could not figure out and knew that people were going to have problems, and it still is hard today, figuring out what character, like what is going on in The Orchard Keeper in terms of characters. So McCarthy, separated with advice from his editor kind of how he was going to approach the writing of this novel. So you could say his editor was also an inspiration to write with more clarity and coherence. McCarthy also started to add with, from advice from his editor, more of the names. We see Cola a lot throughout the novel, and we get Rinthy later on, but that was an inspiration because with The Orchard Keeper, once again, it was kind of hard at times to see, and understand who some of the characters were at certain times of the novel. So another major influence in Outer Dark is the triune, the trio, right? And an interesting note is that they didn't get added into the story until 9 months of writing. After 9 months of drafting, they finally got added in. And there are different angles that you can look at them as. Obviously, like one of the main takes is that they kind of represent the Trinity or something related to Christianity. But you could also take more of a Greek angle that they represent, Eupheses, the famous Greek trio in Greek mythology. So now we kind of get to a part of, so when he was actually writing about the trio, he mentions King David in the Bible, David in the Bible. And there's actually a great connection to William Faulkner. We're going to be reading from Diane C. Lucy's work on McCarthy's early novels right now, stating that clearly McCarthy had been thinking during the dissolution of his marriage about the ruthlessness of the Hebrew singer king favored by God. And we might speculate that in the summer of 1963, he had been reading or rereading both 2 Samuel and William Faulkner's reworking of David's stories in Absalom. Faulkner described his novel as a story of a man who wanted a son but got too many, so that they ended up destroying one another and thwarting his hopes. And Absalom revisited the fratricide among David's grown sons, which further fulfilled the terrible prophecy that his children would suffer for his sins. David's son Ammon raped his own half-sister Tamar, and her brother Absalom killed Ammon in turn. Acts of incest and revenge Faulkner reimagines in Judith Supton's engagement to her unacknowledged half-brother Charles Bond and her brother Henry's killing Bond to prevent the marriage. However, Outer Dark seems little indebted to Faulkner's novel in its quite indifferent employment of the Davidian themes of sexual sin, incest, and the suffering of children. McCarthy does not make the sinner's child an adult actor in his novel, keeping in the role of the infant victim. And we know that there's this connection here because he contemplated calling one of the trio Uriah, which would connect him to the David story. So our next major theme is Cormac McCarthy's existentialism. And this may be, at some level, a reaction to his experience with his life, Lee McCarthy, because around the worst time and right when he started working on the work, he quotes Camus, and Michael Lynn Cruz in his books Are Made Out of Books, the literary influences of Cormac McCarthy, plays this up and doesn't make the connection that Diane C. Lucy makes, that he's maybe experiencing existential dread because of his obliteration of his marriage. And McCarthy writes in an early draft of his of Outer Dark that because the highest aspirations of man are spiritual, therefore it demeans him to say that the highest purpose is simply to eliminate pain. And McCarthy actually wrote minimize as an alternative. And that's interesting because you can't eliminate the pain of a divorce, but you can minimize the pain. And I think that's what he's going through, because a lot of young men, you guys should let me know, a lot of, especially young men and people who in those early years would find existentialism as a way to cope. And they use that. When I was 13, 14, and I was given and shown existentialism by a great English teacher, it changed my life, but it did send me into a sort of pessimism, but it helped me deal with some of the trauma and other things I was going through at the time, and it became a mindset, and it became something to contrast and fight and push back against, a lot of the crap that, public education and other stuff puts upon you. And when we look at McCarthy's existentialism in terms of characters and the influence of Camus, it's very apparent, because when you look at like the myth of Sisyphus, we have this absurd character, but his characters have action, right? They don't get, and Sisyphus does not stop pushing the rock up the hill, the boulder. He is pessimistic, philosophically pessimistic, and we could say McCarthy is too. McCarthy really is trying to engage with what is right in the world, what is morally responsible. In his most recent interview, I haven't talked about this on the channel yet, I will soon, he talks about why Wittgenstein is, better than Heidegger, because Wittgenstein was worried about what is the purpose of philosophy and of life, and what is right and wrong, and like all these different types of questions. And that's the same with existentialism. It likes to bring you back to some of the raw and honest contemplation of life, and not to retreat, but to brace reality. If you look at characters, like very absurd characters. Obviously, Cola in Outer Dark, but just to, outline really fast, Suttree is the most absurd. And then, when we look at the whole Border trilogy, Billy Parham and John Grady are these absurd characters who don't move away though. They move toward action. They are in these absurd scenarios, but they move toward action. McCarthy actually does something kind of interesting too. Most of the time we start with these characters. We look at the Border trilogy and Suttree and Outer Dark. They kind of start with clarity. They kind of start with this existentialist clarity, and then it sometimes devolves a little bit as time goes on because of the technological influences or other things like we've talked about on this channel before. And when we look at Cola, and his sister Rinthi, they are kind of these absurd characters. They just are kind of, they are very flat. McCarthy meant to write these characters, quote, "In order for this book to make sense, the events must assume the shape of a character and the characters themselves become mere moves, mere manifestations of the perfect, coherent, logical, and immutable deformation of evolving fate." So we kind of see this flatness with the characters, right? And they become allegorical. And this is a very classic technique that poets used to use before Christianity destroyed nature. That poets would, I'm looking at nature outside my window, they would observe nature as and write and use the forms of nature, the form of a plant or a wolf as their poetic form. They weren't using iambic pentameter. They were rather mirroring nature with their poetry. And this is, at some level what McCarthy's trying to say, that the characters become in perfect alignment with the logical coordination of fate, of the universe, of whatever. But at some level, that seems to create these absurd characters who have these wants and desires, and they continue to push forward. They continue going on. Rinthi has, her breasts are bleeding and have problems, and Cola is getting hunted left and right and having all these problems, but they continue moving forward. And it's absurd because they run in, Cola keeps running into this trio. He gets saved by them on the river. And obviously, I'm going to cover because the whole existentialist and McCarthy rabbit hole is endless. That's like an hour-plus presentation that needs to happen at some point. But, I'm just trying to focus on Outer Dark here with minimal jumping to other things. And there's just there's so many major biblical influences because when you kind of examine what he was like in a lot of the earlier drafts, and this was something that McCarthy tried to pivot from the Orchard Keeper. He wanted to kind of show the interiority of Cola, especially Cola, and some of his, first at the start, like the shame and guilt of the child, being left. And, this started to evolve with the dream sequences, that McCarthy was actually looking to the Bible and to other things and involving these dream sequences and playing with them. And he actually wrote, it seems like, from what Diane Lucy's saying, at least 50 that don't even make the novel. It's almost like a very playful thing, very subconscious thing that maybe integrates symbolic things and seeing what kind of worked. So you could say that, Outer Dark is McCarthy's most autobiographical novel, that, dealing with the pain of the divorce and then, and then with the additions of his editor's, tips for him, he kind of masked a lot of the pain in the story that he was going through with this narrative. And it's interesting that actually Camus comes up again in The Crossing with, quote, "Billy tells John Grady that when you're a kid, you have these notions about how life is going to be. But when you get a little older and you pull back on that, I think you wind up just trying to minimize the pain." These connections, McCarthy's like, that's what you do as a writer. You steal. That's a direct link, to that Camus thought. So let me know if I missed anything. Obviously, go check out my other video on The Crossing, speaking of The Crossing, and the literary influences of that, and have a great day, everybody. Peace.